Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this presentation. Well, it concerns the International Library of African Music based at Rhodes University in South Africa. And it is the institution or the archive or the library or the repository, if you like, is widely known. And so I wouldn't spend much time discussing the history of the archive, except to say that it was established in 1954 by Hugh Tracey. So the basis of the collections at Arnhem are the recordings and musical instruments. Of course, for the benefit of this presentation, I will focus on the recordings or one in particular. And I need to mention as well that Hugh Tracey, since the 1920s, produced two series of music recordings. One is called The Music of Africa, which consists of 25 LPs. The second series is The Sound of Africa, which consists of 218 LPs. So the music was captured in the field, recorded, and of course underwent numerous migrations until today when it's available as an MP3 file. So important in this migration is the movement from the tangible to the intangible. And for me, the implications for the aura and authenticity of the music. So I examined the role of Hugh Tracey in the mechanical reproduction of African sounds and in the recontextualization of the aura and authenticity. I am intrigued by the origins of the sounds and how the aura speaks to the transformation of the recording industry in South Africa and the value or authenticity of the recordings in the present. This point is emphasized or informed by Benjamin, who reminds us of the aura and what happens to it as it is reproduced mechanically in large numbers over time. He asks, as the object became reproduced, did its aura disappear, or could it be reimagined or reinterpreted as something else? I'm also intrigued by the technological historicity of the mechanically reproduced sounds. How may these recorded sounds, captured first on reels, address the aura of the mechanized sounds reproduced by Hugh Tracey as he traveled far and wide to record the music? Then again, we also need to look at the context of the African continent at the time. The images, perceptions of the continent as unchanging and how tradition remains fixed. So how can we imagine aura as tied to the presence of the original and how it cannot be replicated and neither can be separated from that of the actor? The concept of order, which is proposed above with reference to a historical musical object, the record, may usefully be illustrated with reference to the order of natural phenomena. So, for example, we look at a beautiful scene, a mountain or whatever phenomenon, and we are either attracted or repulsed by that scene. And I think the aura has a lot to do with our reactions to it, and the same may account for the music. The aura of the music is something that appeals to us, attracts us, or repulses us. So in our context again, Hugh Tracey, there are key concepts which need to be taken into account. There's issues of colonialism, decolonialism, critiques leveled at Hugh Tracey for his apparent privileges as a white male and also as a member of the British imperialist project, and decolonization and so on. And of course, the archive also seen as the colonial repository, conveying this sense of authority and power associated with colonialism. So key concepts include notions of mechanical reproduction, authenticity, aura, or prosthesis, which I will come back to shortly, digital return and beyond digital return. So I'm going to start with a recording made by Hugh Tracey in 1950 in Kenya. It's a song called Chemerocha. It has a certain kind of beauty as well, because which speaks to the colonial encounter, as the Kipsigi girls who sings the song were exposed to the country music of Jimmy Rogers, which were introduced by um, local missionaries and so on. So they recognized that because the missionary, the authority they held, that this music also then had some kind of authority. So having listened to the songs and having given Jimmy Rogers a new name, Chemi Rocha, they assumed some of the power of the original performer, Jimmy Rogers. So I would like you to imagine this recording as um, again representing so many different aspects. There's the aura, there's the authenticity, this kind of overlap and distortions and manipulations, which is captured in sound. Right, so this song is as a very special reference or meaning, because at the end of this presentation I will play another version of the song, again trying to imagine this recording that Hugh Tracey made, its numerous implications, and then what happens a few decades later to this. On this slide, I come to the image, to the idea of the prosthesis, which again, we think of the archive, we think of the recordings being made in the field, we think of these collections of recordings being made, being taken to Johannesburg, for example, being reproduced on vinyl records and then being sold and broadcast on various radio stations. So in these images, you see Hugh Tracey on the left with a microphone. It's like he's holding the microphone for the community. These are the so-called Mbuti pygmies, and he's recording the voices singing. So you can see how this microphone is being used. And at the bottom, you'll see a picture of the same people listening to recordings of the music. On the right-hand side, you'll see Andrew Tracey, Hugh Tracey's son, in similar mode with his microphones, recording performers and so on. So it's been my argument, again, that with these pieces of technology we take for granted, actually extensions of the human body, since Hugh Tracey has this kinds of being critiqued of being a colonial agent and so forth. And here we can see how this microphone extends that power, that authority to interfere, to intervene, to take perhaps without permission. So how do these things, these practices, the recording techniques, this imposition of the microphone, how does it influence ideas of order and authenticity? So in the spirit of the colonial, of recordings without any rights issues involved, I want to argue that the microphone in these images represents a prosthesis, and that it emphasizes the technologies of empire. The microphone is a prosthetic. Like all prostheses, it is a mechanism of defense and attack. In much the same way, the microphone is an extension of Hugh Tracey's human body. Indeed, one can consider it as a natural extension of his body, as he uses it to direct, influence, and command the voices of those who are being recorded. But their voices is not an independent entity. Rather, their voices emit, represent, and are manipulated. yeah, distort it and provide the links of their existences as the indigene or the colonizer. But the voice is also productive, revealing itself as the extension of the owner's agency. The voice itself comes from the throat and is, in a certain sense, also prosthetic, a device which is trained, disciplined, accented, and pitched through many screens of personal, educational, and cultural interventions. What kind of order does a situation such as this prescribe or um, present? In this CD of slide, we have various images. You can see on the top left the reels and the vinyl records and the shellac records on the right-hand side. This movement from the field recording to the MP3, which, and again, the implications for the aura. I think for me, tangibility enhances the aura and authenticity of the listening experience. What are the implications for something such as the MP3 file, which is intangible? This requires imagination, an imagination based on that which is ephemeral, transient, and almost analogous with the passage of time, which does not stand still, and one has to mobilize certain faculties to keep certain aspects of the listening and the musical experience alive. So recordings, museums, archives, repositories, all those kinds of things. So these recordings have allowed us to listen to the music 6-7 decades later, perhaps very soon, even 100 years. So the question is also what happens to these recordings? Do they lie low, remain in the cold room in the archive? Do they assume what kinds of happens as they migrate from one format to the next, as they encounter new audiences, new situations, and so on? So of course at ILAM we started the process of what is called digital return, and even beyond digital return, with my predecessors and several students and researchers looking at digital return as archival practice. And of course the recording forms the basis of this exercise to understand how communities receive a digitized recording. So at the moment, we're also busy with a project which deals with beyond digital return, as we assume that digital return is a very passive, kind of a unidirectional process. Instead, we try now to look at what happens beyond digital return. How do these recordings that were made by Hugh Tracey in the 1950s, 40s, up to the 70s, how are they received by local communities? How do local communities reinterpret these sounds or reproduce these sounds in their understanding of the language? So one example is one made by my colleague who tried to understand how local communities listened to the songs and how they reinterpreted these sounds. This is an example of a young rapper using a traditional tune to play or perform a very modern style of music.
Kanti into ikuthetha ngokhumba euyokokuba mama kanti into ikuthetha ngokhumba euyokokuba
mandithatha ithuba lokutyikitya ngokusingqongileyo sihamba kwiingingqi ezigcwele isinyunyu ezinyelisa indalo akukho nabantu othatha uxanduva sithini ngezifo ezingeze ngequbulo koodade nabantakwethu ndithi masiphume iphulo sicoce iingingqi zethu masiphume iphulo sicoce iingingqi zethu ucoceko ngundoqo kwintlalo ucoceko ngundoqo kwintlalo masiphane izandla koodade nabantakwethu masiphane izandla koodade nabantakwethu akhumbula.
Right, so this is the perfect example of it's not the order, the authenticity, how it's reconstituted, recontextualized, reimagined by younger generations of listeners. In this, from a musicological perspective, it's also what it brings to attention is how do we perceive or understand our disciplines, of musicology, for example, when the aesthetics of the music are being transformed and made appropriate to its existing situation. Right, another example is how the recordings are being remixed. This is an organization called Beating Heart. They have taken a lot of the Hugh Tracey's records and recordings and so on and returned it to various communities in Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, for example, and allowed local mixers and rappers and hip hoppers to remix the sounds using so the sounds are almost unrecognizable, but they do form the main ingredient of these new reproductions of the songs. And so there have been numerous attempts to take Hugh Tracey's recordings, to reinvent them, to use them the basis for music education, textbooks, for example. So earlier I played the song called Chemirocha by this group of Kipsigi women, young girls in Kenya, and this is a remix of the very same song. I would like again to think, what do these songs reveal about issues of authenticity, the order?
In the way I walk, in the way I talk, in the way I walk, in the way I talk.
In this song, you could hear there's a surplus of signifiers, and which is almost similar to the situation in 1950 when Hugh Tracey made the earliest recording of Chemirocha in Kenya. It's now 70 years later, and the multiple layers of meanings in the performance of the song, they've been recontextualized, but they also kind of continue with some ideas of the authentic, some ideas of the order, which are no longer, maybe not the same, but different and fresh. So what can we learn from the migration over time and space of recording from one format to another? In this presentation, we have learned the following. On the question of authenticity, Benjamin observes that the presence of the original is a prerequisite to the concept of authenticity. Shall we then refer to the remix, as in the Babaneko example of Chemirocha, as an authentic rendition of the song? Can one absolve the 78 RPM disc of its complicity in the recontextualization of a song's presumed authenticity in the here and now? What we have seen and heard here is that the technical reproduction of an original can put the copy of the original into situations which would be out of reach for the original itself. That is, if we assume that there was indeed an original, and that the recording of the original performance was not the result of transculturation. But clearly that is not the case. The reproduced sounds do, however, enable the original to meet the beholder halfway, or the listener, be it in the form of a photograph or a phonograph record. What is the impact on tradition? One might generalize by saying that reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition. By making many reproductions, it substitutes a plurality of copies for a unique existence and in permitting the reproduction to meet the beholder or listener in his own particular situation, it reactivates the reproduced sounds. These processes lead to a tremendous shattering of tradition. In conclusion, an analysis of recording the age of mechanical reproduction must do justice to the relationships of the here and now, of the juxtaposition of the original context to the present, for they lead us to an all-important insight, which is that the mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its dependence on ritual. To an even greater degree, the work of art reproduced becomes a work of art designed for reproducibility as mass production and mass consumption. From its first inscription on reel tape, for example, one can make any number of prints, and to ask for the authentic print makes no sense. Authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production, and the total function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it begins to be based on another practice, politics. That is, the politics of the modern archive. Thank you.